Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture for Chapter 5. I apologize in advance if I sound a little sniffly. I've got a bit of a cold, but we're going to hopefully get through this module. It will definitely be the longest module within this chapter. This chapter isn't very long in general, and this first module we're really going to focus on sleep and the different stages and different sleep disorders and things like that. So it'll definitely be kind of the most content heavy of the chapter. So we'll get started. So chapter 5 is on consciousness. And the first module is biological rhythms of consciousness, and specifically we're going to talk a lot about wakefulness and sleep. So as for the definition of consciousness, we would say that consciousness is a person's subjective awareness, including their thoughts, perceptions, experiences of the world, and their self-awareness. So as psychologists, we spend a lot of our time attempting to explore the links between fluctuations in our subjective experience and the changes in things like hormone levels and brain activity. So we've discovered that many of these changes in states of consciousness occur in rhythmic cycles, so they often vary predictably over time. So in this chapter, we hope to examine some of the ways in which our consciousness varies over time, as well as some of the techniques used to alter our states of consciousness. So for example, we will be talking about things like hypnosis and psychoactive drugs as well in this chapter. So you've probably all heard of biorhythm charts, which supposedly forecast future fluctuations in things like alertness, mood, and physical performance based on things like when you were born, and they have been scientifically proven to be completely useless. So how then might we attempt to predict these phenomena over time? So things like when you're the most alert, changes in your mood, changes in your ability to perform particular tasks. And we found essentially what we can use are things called biological rhythms. So these are a periodic and fairly regular fluctuation in physiological functioning, and they may also influence our psychological functioning as well. So we have biological clocks, which govern things like our hormone levels, our blood pressure, and these rhythms tend to be synchronized with external cues such as temperature, daylight, and time of day. So basically, when we find that these rhythms are kind of synchronized with external cues, we would say that they're exhibiting entrainment. So entrainment basically means that they're synchronized with external cues. They're not essentially created internally. And the opposite of that would be endogenous. So some rhythms may continue to occur even without external time cues. They're generated from within, and we label those as endogenous, which are basically generated by our body independent of external cues such as light or time of day. So circadian rhythms are a special type of biological rhythm. They are internally driven daily cycles of approximately 24 hours in length. So when we talk about circadian rhythms, we are always talking about 24 hours in length. They can affect both our physiological and our behavioral processes. And it's important to note that there are various other types of biological rhythms that occur both less often, which would be labeled as infraradian, or more often, which would be labeled as ultraradian. So for example, an example of infraradian would be hibernation, because it occurs on an annual basis rather than a daily basis. And an example of something that's ultraradian, we could say sleep cycles, because the stages within our sleep, they alternate on approximately a 90-minute cycle. So these rhythms can influence anything and everything from the effectiveness of the medication we take to things like our alertness or our job performance. So circadian rhythms reflect the adaptations of organisms to changes associated with the rotation of the Earth, such as changes in light, temperature, and air pressure fluctuation. So obviously we know that all of these things fluctuate on a daily basis, and so therefore the circadian rhythms kind of adapted in response to those changes. So therefore we see that people's circadian rhythms often become entrained to these external cues. In order for us to determine which rhythms are endogenous, so kind of like they're created from within, scientists can isolate volunteers from cues related to time. So they can place them in specially designed rooms where they're not able to see any clocks or any form of kind of time tracking, and they're also not able to see things like sunlight, which might provide external cues to what time of day it might be. So we find that people who are put in these special environments, if they are allowed to take naps, most participants will live a day very close to 24 hours. So it seems like even in the absence of those external cues, a lot of those rhythms will kind of remain within a 24-hour cycle. We see that body temperatures and hormone levels will still cycle approximately every 24 hours, even when participants are subjected to an artificial 28-hour day. So if they're made to believe that each day lasts 28 hours, just based on the external cues that they're being given, we still see that a lot of these things will fluctuate on the original 24-hour schedule. In general, we see that alertness and temperature tend to peak in the late afternoon, and they are lowest in the very early morning, which kind of makes sense because I'm sure you can all kind of relate to not feeling as alert in the early morning, and you're probably much more alert by, say, mid to late afternoon. So here is a little kind of diagram that shows how sleep requirements change as we age. So we do see that in general, as people age, they tend to need a lot of less sleep overall. So, when if you're beginning in, your first year or two of life, you need, maybe upwards of 16 hours. And, even by age 2, still more than 12 hours of sleep per night. Whereas if you're getting up to, 40, 50, 60, you might need even less than 8 hours of sleep a night. So we do see that the requirements change as we age. People tend to spend progressively less time sleeping, and the amount of a certain type of sleep, which is known as REM sleep, and we'll talk about that in a minute, we see that declines even more so than sleep in general. So we should also mention that later in adulthood, many people find themselves going to bed earlier and getting up earlier than they did maybe as teenagers or young adults. And these would be examples of changes in what we call a chronotype. So your chronotype is your tendency to prefer sleeping earlier or later within a given 24-hour period. So as we age, our chronotype change. Not only do we require less sleep in general, but our chronotype also tends to change as well. So I mentioned earlier that we do have kind of a biological clock. So circadian rhythms are controlled by what is known as our biological clock, which is a tiny teardrop-shaped cluster of cells in the hypothalamus known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. So special receptors in the back of our eye, in our retina, are connected by neural pathways to the SCN, and they transmit information which enables it to respond to changes in light levels. So the SCN then sends messages to the rest of the body and brain that cause them to adapt to these changes. So, for example, in the absence of light, so when light starts to decrease, our SCN would then notify the pineal gland to start releasing melatonin, which you may have heard of. It's a hormone that helps to make us sleepy. I believe I mentioned it a little bit in the last chapter on biological psychology as well. So essentially the SCN can kind of react to things such as changes in light level, and then it will also kind of communicate with other parts of the brains or other parts of the body to let it know what to do in response to these changes. So it's kind of like our little timekeeper. So sleep is actually one of the most perplexing biological rhythms to researchers. Technically, when we sleep, it puts ourselves at risk for, attack by predators. We're essentially our most vulnerable when we're sleeping, so why is it such a necessity? We have determined that humans spend approximately a third of their lives asleep. And then Nathaniel Kleitman, he was a researcher who discovered that the slow rolling eye movements associated with the onset of sleep did not continue throughout the night. So instead, at some point during sleep, rapid eye movements began to take over. So this researcher used an EEG, or electroencephalogram, which we talked about in the last chapter, to measure brain activity, and he was able to correlate changes in brainwave patterns with the onset of these rapid eye movements. So the use of the EEG is an example of something called polysomnography, which is a set of objective measurements used to examine physiological variables during sleep. So basically using the EEG to monitor brainwaves during sleep would be an example of the use of polysomnography. So this rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, is a stage of sleep characterized by quickening brain waves, inhibited body movement, meaning that we can't really move our muscles, we're kind of paralyzed, and rapid eye movements. So it begins with periods of less eye movement, it alternates with periods of less eye movement, which we call non-REM or NREM sleep, in approximately 90-minute cycle. So REM periods average about 20 minutes in length, and they include a change in brain activity to waves that resemble alert wakefulness. So instead of the really slow rolling brain waves that are kind of characteristic of sleep, when we enter REM sleep, our brain activity essentially looks like it does when we're awake. So the non-REM periods are also divided into distinct stages, each of which is associated with a particular pattern in brain waves. So when we first begin to relax in anticipation of sleep, our brain emits primarily alpha waves, which have a regular slow rhythm and high amplitude. So alpha waves, we're still technically awake, but we're relaxing and we're getting ready to enter sleep. In stage 1 of sleep, the waves slow down and become higher in amplitude, so they're then known as theta waves. Things like breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate all decrease slightly, and we stay in this stage for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Then we move on to stage 2 of sleep, which includes short bursts of rapid low amplitude waves known as sleep spindles, as well as small groups of larger amplitude waves known as K complexes. So neither of these types of waves are completely understood, but we feel that they may help to maintain sleep and with our memory storage. And so we stay in stage 2 of sleep for approximately 20 minutes. Stage 3, the waves continue to slow down. We begin to emit what we call delta waves, which are very slow. They have very high peaks. We see at this stage that breathing and pulse have slowed even further. The muscles have relaxed, and it's very hard to wake somebody who's in stage 3 sleep. And so stages 3 and 4 combined take approximately 30 minutes. Stage 4 is when the delta waves have taken over. So at this point you're in a very deep sleep. It would take a lot to wake you. And what we see in terms of sequence is that the stages progress from 1 to 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4, which takes about an hour. And then we actually cycle back up through. So we go from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And instead of waking up like you would assume we do after stage 1, we enter REM sleep. So basically it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, REM. And so that's kind of how the cycles progress with respect to sleep throughout the course of the night. So you can see here a little bit about the brain waves that I was just talking about in each of the stages. So our awake waves are what's known as beta waves. Awake and calm, we have what are known as alpha waves. In stage 1, we get the theta waves, and then stage 2 is primarily characterized by more of these theta waves as well as those sleep spindles and K complexes. And then in stages 3 and 4, we've entered delta waves, delta wave sleep. So you can see that they have very high peaks and they're very kind of slow waves. And then when we enter into REM sleep, you can see that it looks very similar to those beta waves that are characteristic of being awake. So as you transition from stage 1 to REM sleep, your brain emits very rapid irregular waves, your heart rate and breathing actually start to increase, your blood pressure rises, and you may experience small twitches in your face and fingers, and skeletal muscles go limp. So REM sleep has been called paradoxical sleep because at this point we see that the brain is very active, but the body is not active at all. So REM sleep is when our most vivid dreams are likely to occur. We do dream a little bit during non-REM sleep, but those dreams tend to be shorter and less vivid. And then we see that REM and non-REM continue to alternate throughout the night, but as the night goes on, we do see that the REM periods begin to lengthen, and the amount of time that we spend in some of the other stages decreases significantly. And we actually see over time, as you can see in this figure here, that you might not necessarily even go all the way back down into that deep sleep phases of stages 3 and 4. So you see the sleep cycles at first, they kind of go 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 REM, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1 REM. And then you can kind of see it's 1, 2, 3, 2, 1 REM, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1 REM, 1, 2, 1 REM. So we spend less time in those deep sleep stages and more time in REM, respectively, as the night progresses. So the reasons for REM sleep are still not entirely known. We know that waking people up as soon as they begin REM does not seem to have a dramatic effect, but when they are allowed to return to sleep, they will spend longer in REM and are harder to rouse. So this is what we call REM rebound. So basically, even though we're not really sure why REM sleep occurs, it definitely shows that it is important and it's something that your body kind of craves. Some people believe that the main function of REM sleep is to dream, but this doesn't really make sense because some brain damage patients cannot dream, but they still have REM sleep. And also the majority of mammals experience REM, but it is unlikely that all of them dream. So therefore, in general, the purpose of REM sleep remains a mystery. Now we're going to talk briefly about why we need sleep. So there are two main theories. Again, this is the question that we can't really answer fully. But the two main theories of why we need sleep involve a restore and repair hypothesis and a preserve and protect hypothesis. So in the restore and repair hypothesis, it basically kind of captures the idea that the body needs to restore energy levels and repair any wear and tear from the day's activities. So this hypothesis is supported by research that shows that a lack of sleep leads to cognitive decline, emotional disturbances, and impaired immune function, but it would suggest that we sleep more after physically or mentally challenging days, which isn't really something that we typically tend to see. The second theory, the preserve and protect hypothesis, would basically state that the two more adaptive functions of sleep are preserving energy and protecting the organism from harm. So this makes sense because animals who are most vulnerable to predators tend to sleep in safe hideaways and during the time of day when they are most susceptible. So basically it seems like maybe they're sleeping to avoid the times that they might be most susceptible to predation. And we do see that predators in general tend to sleep more and kind of be less picky about the times at which they sleep. So again, this is kind of lends support to this hypothesis, but we're still not really sure which, if either of the theories, is correct. So this kind of leads us to the topic of sleep deprivation. So up until now, I've kind of described the stages of sleep and why sleep might be important. We're not really sure, but the fact remains that it definitely is. And this can be illustrated by some of the studies of what we call sleep deprivation. So we see that even a disturbance as small as daylight savings time can have a dramatic effect on people's functioning. So for example, if you look at this figure over here, if you look at car accidents and those that occur both before and immediately after the fall shift and the spring shift for daylight savings time, well, the fall shift, as we just experienced this past weekend, is typically associated with an increased amount of sleep because people are actually kind of gaining an extra hour to sleep. But with the spring shift, we see that people actually tend to lose an hour of sleep. And what we see is that after the fall shift, there's no increase in accidents, and there actually seems to kind of be an overall decrease in accidents. Whereas after the spring shift, when people lose that 1 hour of sleep, we tend to see a really kind of high increase in the amount of car accidents immediately after that shift. So that would kind of indicate perhaps that one of the reasons for the increased number of car accidents might be due to that minor sleep deprivation experienced during the daylight savings shift. So sleep deprivation is defined as occurring when an individual cannot or does not sleep, either due to external or self-inflicted factors. And in 1896, researchers kept people awake for 90 hours straight and then examined their cognitive abilities. And so what they have found, and what researchers have found since, is that not only increasing levels of sleepiness each night, but also impairments in multitasking, maintaining attention, assessing risks, working memory function, as well as keeping information in order. So we can definitely see that sleep deprivation is associated with a lot of impairments in cognitive functioning. So sleep deprivation has also been shown to be linked to things such as physical illness, family problems, substance abuse, and academic problems. So it's actually shown that being sleep deprived can actually put you at a similar level of impairment as driving drunk. And we see in this figure here, traditionally, as a medical intern, they used to have up to a 31-hour on-call shift, so 31 hours consecutively. And then they modified the schedule to divide that 31 hours into 2 shorter shifts, because of course if you have to work 31 hours straight, you're going to be dealing with some level of sleep deprivation. And what they saw is that when they modified the schedule, it actually seemed to reduce the effects of the sleep deprivation as measured in terms of medical errors. So you can see on the side here, the group who had to do the 31-hour straight on-call shifts, they made significantly more medical errors than did the group who had the more modified schedule where they had shorter periods of on-call. Now we'll talk briefly about sleep displacement. So it's not exactly the same thing as sleep deprivation. In sleep displacement, the individual is able to sleep, but they're prevented from sleeping at the normal time. So they could sleep either later or earlier in the day than usual. And we've also seen that this could lead to cognitive and coordination errors as well. So an example of sleep displacement, which a lot of us have probably experienced, is jet lag. So jet lag is the discomfort that a person feels when sleep cycles are out of synchronization with light and darkness. We find that it is typically easier to stay up later, so to adjust to a more Western time zone, than it is to fall asleep earlier than usual, which would be kind of adjusting to a more Eastern time zone. And sleep deprivation is not always caused by external factors. It can be caused by our own behaviors as well, for example, consuming caffeine before bed. So now we're going to talk briefly about theories of dreaming. So we talked a little bit about why we sleep. Now we're going to talk a little bit about why we dream and some of the theories surrounding that. So in the Western world, many beliefs about the meaning of dreams come from Freud's psychoanalytical perspective. So he was actually the one who published a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, kind of started that dream interpretation movement. So Freud would say that dreams are an unconscious expression of wish fulfillment. So basically that humans are motivated by primal urges, specifically sex and aggression, but we often cannot act on them, so they are suppressed outside conscious awareness. However, he would say that when we sleep, we lose our ability to suppress these urges, and they are revealed through the manifest content, which would be the images and storylines that we dream about, as well as the latent content, which he would say is the actual symbolic meaning of a dream built on suppressed sexual or aggressive urges of our dreams. So he would say that basically the manifest content would provide us information about that latent content, and that would tell us what the true meaning of our dream was. So of course, as you can probably imagine, dream interpretation lacks scientific evidence and objective measurements. So why then do you think we dream? There are a few more modern theories of dreaming. There are 3 modern theories. Only 2 are discussed in this textbook, but I left the 3rd in here as well because I think it's really important and probably one of the better ones. So the first is the problem-solving theory, which basically states that thoughts and concerns are continuous from waking to sleeping, and that our dreams may function to help facilitate us finding solutions to the problems encountered while awake. So we do see that REM sleep increases after learning new tasks, which may be indicative of a memory improvement from sleep. The second is the cognitive theory, which would agree that dreams emphasize current concerns, but makes no claims about problem solving. So yes, we dream about the things we think about in daily life, but we're not necessarily trying to solve our problems. So the cognitive theory views dreams as the brain doing the same kind of work as when it was awake, and it explains why the same parts of our cerebral cortex are activated during dreams as would be during the perceptual and cognitive processing in daily life. And the brain shows the same activity for night dreaming as daydreaming, so this kind of shows us that dreams may be a mechanism for simulating events. And then finally, we have the activation synthesis theory, which would basically state that dreams arise from brain activity originating from bursts of excitatory messages from the pons during REM sleep. So if you remember, the pons is a portion of our brainstem, as we talked about in the chapter on biological psychology. And so basically, it would say that the pons sends out all these signals, and the signals have no psychological meaning themselves, but the cortex tries anyway to make sense of them by synthesizing them with our existing knowledge and memories, which would account for the incoherent and confusing qualities of dreams. Because of course, if your brain is trying to make sense of random signaling, it's probably going to come up with some very kind of silly interpretations at times. So basically this would say that the brain regions for logical thought are shut down, so dreams tend to be illogical because they're interpreted based on the signaling, and the part of your brain that would tell you whether it's logical or not isn't really awake at that point. So all three of these theories account for some of the evidence, but each has its drawbacks as well. So even though the problem-solving theory makes sense in that we do tend to dream about problems that we're having, skeptics doubt that the dreams can actually resolve problems. Not all dreams are as disjointed as the activation synthesis theory would predict. So yes, we do have some kind of crazy illogical dreams, but we also have a lot of dreams that are very rational and logical. And it also does not account for non-REM dreams, so the activation synthesis theory only applies to REM dreaming. And the cognitive approach does seem promising, but it does not yet have all its claims tested, so we still need to conduct further research into that cognitive theory of dreaming. So in general, right now, the purpose of dreaming still remains a mystery. So now we're going to talk about some sleep disorders. So what are some of the disorders that can influence whether or not somebody is getting enough sleep? The first I want to talk about is insomnia. It's by far the most common sleep disorder. It's characterized by an extreme lack of sleep, and it is defined by how rested a person feels during the day. So it's very hard to define how much sleep we need. As we know, different people have different requirements for sleep. But basically, we're going to characterize and diagnose insomnia based on how well rested the person feels and how much that lack of sleep is actually impacting their day-to-day functioning. So insomnia can involve difficulty falling asleep, which would be onset insomnia, or staying asleep, which would be maintenance insomnia if it's having trouble with kind of awakening multiple times throughout the night, or terminal insomnia if you have trouble with waking up too early and not being able to get back to sleep. And it affects about 17% of Canadian adults. It can result from anxiety, psychological problems, physical problems, or irregular or demanding work schedules. And unfortunately, the effects of insomnia can impact pretty much all areas of our life. So in terms of our cognitive functioning, our social functioning, ability to go to work and be productive. So there are a lot of negative impacts associated with severe cases of insomnia for sure. In order to be labeled as insomnia, your textbook states that the problems must have an internal cause. If it is part of another problem, so for example, depression, pain, it is called secondary insomnia. This is actually not, even though this is the newest edition of the textbook, this isn't really fully updated to the most recent version of the DSM, which basically they've kind of taken out the secondary insomnia kind of subtype, and now basically if you're having both issues, you can be diagnosed with both. But according to the textbook, we're going to continue calling it secondary insomnia for the purposes of this course. So now we'll talk briefly about nightmares and night terrors. So I'm sure you've all heard of nightmares. They're particularly vivid and disturbing dreams that occur during REM sleep. They're seemingly correlated with psychological stress, and they are more common in females than males, which might be due to higher levels of emotional disturbance. They can actually be so emotionally charged that they awaken the individual, and as many as 85 to 95% of adults can remember having kind of some form of nightmare within the past year. So although unpleasant, nightmares are a normal part of life, unlike night terrors. Night terrors are intense bouts of panic and arousal that awaken the individual, typically in a heightened emotional state, and these occur during non-REM sleep. So a person who's having a night terror may scream, they may fight imaginary opponents, or leap from bed and flee before waking, and most do not remember the specific content of the night terror. So they are more common in young children. So night terrors occur in approximately 1 to 6% of children versus only 1% of adults, and they tend to increase during times of stress. Now we'll talk about some sleep disorders that are characterized by issues with movement. So restless leg syndrome you may have heard of. It's a persistent feeling of discomfort in the legs and the urge to continuously shift them into different positions, and it affects about 5 to 10% of the population. I don't believe this one is talked about in the current textbook, so I won't go into any more detail than that. But two that are discussed in the textbook are somnambulism and REM behavior disorder. So somnambulism, also known as sleepwalking, is a disorder that involves wandering and performing other activities while asleep. It tends to be more common in children, and it usually occurs during stages 3 and 4, so within our non-REM sleep. And contrary to popular belief, it is not dangerous to awaken somebody who is sleepwalking. REM behavior disorder, on the other hand, is when the person does not show the typical restriction of movements during REM sleep. So when we talked about REM sleep, I discussed how basically during REM sleep your muscles are kind of paralyzed. You can't really move around a lot. So in REM behavior disorder, basically when a sleeper, usually a male, it is more common in males, lapses into REM sleep, they do not experience that typical muscle paralysis and they become physically active. So they often act out their dreams, they may be unaware of what they're doing, and they may harm themselves or others. So thankfully, REM behavior disorder, because it can be very dangerous, it can be treated effectively with medication. You may have also heard of sleep apnea. So apnea literally translates to without breathing. So sleep apnea is a disorder characterized by the temporary inability to breathe during sleep, which causes the person to choke and gasp. So a lot of the time they're basically waking up, tens if not hundreds of times a night, kind of gasping. They might not remember it, but typically it is pretty disruptive to your sleep. So it's most often seen in older males or overweight people. It can have several causes, for example, blocked passages or brain control of respiration, issues there. Over time, it can cause high blood pressure and irregular heartbeat, and it is actually associated with a shortened life expectancy as well. So thankfully, it can be treated with either dental devices or CPAP machines, CPAP standing for continuous positive airway pressure. So there are a few effective treatments for sleep apnea. And the final disorder I want to mention to you is narcolepsy. So it's a disorder in which a person experiences extreme daytime sleepiness and even sleep attacks, and it essentially causes them to fall immediately into REM for 5 to 30 minutes. The sufferers also sometimes experience something called cataplexy, which is muscle weakness or paralysis, so they'll kind of slump over, they lose control of their muscles. And then it is also linked to lessened production of auroxin, which is a substance that helps us maintain wakefulness. So I do have a little video for you. Okay, so I just tried a version of this where I basically played the video and recorded myself kind of talking over it. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing from the slideshow view here in PowerPoint is that it doesn't actually play the video for you. So I think what I'll do is I'll let you watch this one yourself. If you want to go to the actual notes for this chapter, you'll see the video within the PowerPoint slide and you're able to watch it. But I basically think this is a really important video to watch because a lot of people tend to make fun of narcolepsy. They think it's kind of silly, and there have been, comedians who have done skits and videos and stuff where, they just basically characterize it as kind of falling asleep all over the place, and that's really funny, but it can be really detrimental to functioning. So definitely take a look at the video. You'll see kind of some of the different stages we just talked about. And if you have any questions about the video, let me know. So finally, the very last thing that I kind of want to go through with you is just this little table from the end of Module 1 that talks about overcoming sleep problems. So if you are having issues with sleeping, whether it's one of the disorders we just listed or just kind of sleeping in general, there are some non-pharmacological techniques to help improve sleep. So I won't really go through these with you, but definitely if you or someone you know has issues with sleeping, I wanted to keep these in here. So that if you ever feel like you need them, you have that information there. So that is the end of Module 1. So hopefully you've learned some interesting information about kind of sleep patterns and different disorders and things like that that can affect your sleep, and some of the theories about sleeping and dreaming. So the next module we'll talk a bit more about some altered states of consciousness. So this one here will be the lecture for November 2nd. And hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you in the next video.